Hi, everyone. It's just a few days before Passover, or in Hebrew, we call it Pesach, is going to begin. And I know that everybody is probably very busy with preparations, getting ready for this amazing holiday. I know here, living in Yerushalayim, we're also get excited about everything that's going to be happening. So I wanted to just give a short, maybe at most 30-minute little discussion about Pesach for those of you that want to join in. I'm going to tie it also into my work with Jews for Judaism, which is focused on helping individuals who've been coerced in some way into either a cult or into a missionary group or Christian missionary group, and to show you how strange some of the arguments that certain Christian missionaries use. They tried to actually use the symbols of Passover in order to create this image and this idea that Jesus fits into everything. So, for example, Christians might make their own mock Seder and point out that the three matzahs that we have are specifically and were put there to represent the Trinity. And they will also say that the broken matzah was in order to demonstrate Jesus's body being broken when he was crucified and hidden away like the afikomen to be resurrected in the future. And the pouring of wine is the pouring of his blood. Yeah, this is a very old idea that was introduced in the Middle Ages to try to find symbolism in Jewish acts to validate for them this belief that Jesus is everywhere. He's found everywhere. It's interesting to note, contrary to their ridiculous argument that the three matzahs are representative of the Trinity, there are so many other answers that could be given for why there are three matzahs. The Jewish law reason is because we know that for every Shabbat, we have two breads, lechem mishnah, because when the Jews were in the desert and they were given the holy bread man from heaven, they were given a double portion so that they wouldn't have to go out on Shabbat and collect it. So we always have two complete challahs or matzot. But because the matzah is also called the poor man's bread or the bread of affliction, we say two blessings on the matzah. One is hamotzi lechem min haaretz, which is made on the completely whole matzahs, and then we break the middle matzah, which is the lechem ani, the poor man's or the bread of affliction, and we make a second blessing on that, al achilat matzah. So this is the reason you need three matzahs. But symbolically, the three matzahs could represent Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But probably the most beautiful thing that I've heard is that there were three different partners that God utilized in taking the Jews out of Egypt. Obviously, the Jews need to be rescued from Egypt. So they're one partner. But Aaron and Moshe also played pivotal roles in taking the Jews out of Egypt. So the three matzahs, one is Moshe, one is Aaron, and the third one is Yisroel. And sometimes you see that people get actually special matzah covers where they place each matzah in a separate area, and there's little tabs, and written on it are the words Yisrael, Kohen, and Levi, because Moshe, Aaron, and the Jewish people represented those three tribes. Moshe was a Levi, Aaron was a Kohen, and the Jewish people are represented as Yisrael. And we start off the Seder with actually a song. Many people have the custom that they read the 15 steps of the Seder. They sing Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. The number 15 is significant because in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple, there were actually 15 steps that led up that the Kohanim would stand on, and they corresponded to 15 Psalms, Psalm 120 through 124, which were called the Psalms of Ascent. So these 15 steps represent those 15 steps that the service of Passover is not simply a recollection of something that happened in the past. It's an opportunity for us to explore and to learn how to be more spiritual in our lives and how to experience the exodus from Egypt in a spiritual way. So we see that the term for coming out of Egypt would seem to many people to be totally irrelevant thousands of years later. We're not in Egypt. We haven't escaped from Egypt recently. But the word Mitzrayim, which is the Hebrew word for Egypt, comes from the word Meitzar. And we find that word in the book of Psalms, Min HaMeitzah, Karati Laka. From our restraint, we call out to God. Mitzrayim was a country at the time that the Jewish people were enslaved, where no one could escape the borders. It reminds me of the Soviet Union prior to the fall of it, and how the Berlin Wall was so strong that people couldn't escape. It was impossible. So Mitzrayim were constraints holding people back from getting out of the idolatry and the unethical, immoral practices that were going on in Egypt. When we say in the Haggadah that we experience as if today we came out of Mitzrayim, it means that we have to look inside ourselves and ask, what limitations do I have that are preventing me from being a better person, from being a better Jew, from being more spiritual, from being kinder toward everyone in the world? I am holding myself back. I have my own limitations. So coming out of Egypt is also an expression of coming out of your own limitations to elevate yourself to a higher spiritual level. And this is symbolized in the very beginning of the service, where we sing these 15 steps that we're going to go through in the Haggadah. And I just want to say, getting to a higher spiritual level, I have found in my life, takes a sense of humility. If we are so full of ourselves as we sometimes express it, it's hard to put in holiness into ourselves. The example is always given that if you want to fill up a cup of water and it's already filled with orange juice, it's kind of hard to fill it up with water because there's something there. You have to humble yourself. You have to make yourself a vessel to receive holiness. And humility is important. And we see one of the steps in the Haggadah, which is kind of interesting, is that we take a vegetable and we dip it into salt water. That vegetable is called karpas. Now, different people use different types of vegetables. Some people use a piece of potato, some people use an onion, some people use parsley. That's not what's important. What is important that you take this vegetable and you are dipping it into salt water. One of the reasons we dip it into salt water is because the salt water represents tears, which are salty. That we want to reenact the bitter tears that the Jewish people experienced when they were slaves in Egypt. We use salt water because it waters down the bitterness of the salt, because we don't want to remember the extreme bitterness. We want to soften that memory and not have it completely overwhelming to us. But I found something in a beautiful Haggadah that I was reading about one of the lessons we can take from karpas. The word karpas is kind of a strange word that we don't use too often, but it reminds us of a similar sounding set of words that occurred right before the original descent down into Egypt. We know that when Yaakov and his children were experiencing their life outside of Egypt, in the land of Canaan, in the land of Israel, Yaakov gave his son, Yosef, a beautifully designed and colored coat. It was made famous with a musical, about Joseph's Technicolor Dream Coat. And in fact, the words for that colored coat are katonas pasim. The word pasim has that sound of the same letters as karpas. And it starts with the letter chaf, which is also part of katonas pasim. Why is that so significant? It's significant because what happened when Yaakov gave a special gift to one son and not the others? It caused jealousy and envy among the brothers. They lacked the humility to appreciate that Yaakov gave this coat for a specific reason. So their jealousy and their envy, their lack of humility caused them to sell, first of all, to throw Yosef in a pit. And eventually, from that, Yosef was sold down and became a slave in Egypt. This represents the very beginning of the Jews descending into Egyptian slavery. It was caused by the envy of the brothers. And how do we rectify that? By bringing unity into our lives. That no one person, no matter what their background, is not equally important to God. And we do that by the next step. In the Haggadah, after we do the karpas, we break the middle matzah into little pieces. That symbolizes that it's not about one piece being special. It's about all the little pieces being special. So in order to start our own process of coming out of Egypt, out of our own limitations, it needs to start with counteracting the sense of envy, jealousy, and find a way to be humble. And to not only that, to recognize that everyone's important. And what better holiday to represent that when we proclaim anyone that's hungry, anyone that needs a place to eat should come and join us. We make it a point of inviting strangers and people to our home so that everyone can enjoy and be part of the Seder. I want to talk now about the exact topic of this evening, about Passover and deprogramming. That's important to me because of the work of Jews for Judaism, because we have utilized certain methods within the deprogramming field to help people. Because really, people that get involved in cults, the biggest challenge is that they have been brainwashed to the point where they don't think critically anymore. They're not willing to hear a second viewpoint. They do that out of fear. They do that because they're afraid of hearing another point, because it might tear them away from the belief system that they feel is giving them tremendous sense of security. They might also be told by the leaders of the cult that any doubt or any questioning shows a lack of faith and commitment to the group. In fact, there was in the 70s a very, very powerful cult, which was predominantly in the United States. And it was founded by a South Korean minister named Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And he proclaimed himself to be the Messiah. And he gathered tens of thousands of followers, especially young college students. And they would indoctrinate these students by offering them an opportunity to go to a free retreat. They would only travel at night in a bus, so they couldn't see where they were going, so they would be disoriented. They would have the lights on in the bus, so they couldn't see outside. They would get to a retreat where they couldn't use their phones. They were given a diet of low protein, so it would weaken their ability to think and to question. They were paired up with individuals that would constantly be checking on them and controlling them if they have any doubts. And they would be treated like children, because if you could mold the person to act like a child, you can start re-educating them. And what happened was parents were frantic because one of the verses that Reverend Moon used to keep people away from their parents was a verse in the New Testament. In the book of Luke, chapter 7, verse 14, it says, Unless you hate your mother and father and brothers and sisters, you cannot be my disciple. That verse, to anyone hearing it for the first time, sounds like a person has to hate their family and put their belief in the Messiah, in this case, Reverend Moon, or in the New Testament, Jesus, put him first and the family second. So Reverend Moon used that verse to tell people they shouldn't trust in their parents anymore. They shouldn't speak to their parents anymore. In fact, I know a woman that was on the staff of a big missionary group, Christian missionary group in San Francisco, that told me that members of that group used this verse to control her to not speak to her own parents. So what happens is the cult uses mind control to limit a person's ability to question, to think for themselves. We see this not only in cults, we see this in terrorist groups, where members of terrorist groups are threatened. They're told if they ask any questions, if they contradict the leadership, they can be punished, they can be hurt. There's lots of manipulation, and also the misuse of passages, whether it's from the New Testament or the Jewish Bible. It doesn't matter. It's always used to manipulate things. That's why I think that the most important concept for me in Judaism is the belief in critical thinking. King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, said in the book of Proverbs, in Mishlei, chapter 18, verse 17, the first to ask a question sounds right until someone comes and questions them. Think about that. The first person to say something always sounds right until someone comes and questions them. It's not saying don't question them. It's saying you should question them. You should always get a second opinion. And I tell people that all the time. It doesn't matter whether you're going to a doctor and he says to have an operation. The doctor may be very smart, but you should still get a second opinion. You want to buy a piece of property, and a guy's telling you, this is the best deal. I got 25 acres in Las Vegas, and it's only $3,000. Sounds great. What can I lose? Get a second opinion. Find out what's going on with that property. Maybe there was nuclear testing on that property. You don't know. Always get a second opinion. And the Torah encourages that. That's why in the Talmud, in the Gemara, what you see is the rabbis constantly asking questions of each other because they don't want to leave any rock unturned. Because if someone would come say, oh, you know what? They wouldn't have come to this conclusion if someone had brought up this question. So they tried to bring every possible question from every direction so that when they do come to a conclusion, they can say, we examined it thoroughly and carefully. So in the 70s, there was a gentleman named Ted Patrick, and he instituted the idea of deprogramming people from cults. And parents would pay him to actually kidnap their children away from the cult because the cult had such a strong grasp on them. And then he would hold them and he would use different methods to try to get them to think critically. Now, the cults caught on to that and started suing him, started pressing charges. So the whole idea of holding a person against their will and kidnapping completely went out the window. It was not something that we ever did. But the tactics of getting a person to think critically, to realize what they are involved in and what steps they can take to get out of it, those tactics can be used very successfully for helping people to re-examine what they're doing. If you can't get a person to re-examine it or be open-minded and they're completely closed-minded, there's really not much you can do. So I thought it was interesting that if we look at the description of the steps that God took in breaking the grasp of idolatry that was holding on to the Jews, our Kabbalistic sages say that the Jews were so sunken so low in their level of spirituality that of the 50 gates of spiritual impurity, the Jewish people were on the 49th gate. Had they stayed there any longer, it would have been too late to redeem them. That's how deeply entrenched they were into the idea of the prevalent idolatry that was taking place in Egypt. So we find in the book of Exodus, in chapter 12, verse 21, a statement that is very interesting, and it appears to be some superfluous words. The verse, the pasuk says, "Vayikra Moshe lekol ziknei Yisrael," and God called out to all the elders of Israel, Vayomer, and he said to them, Mishchu ukechu lachem sayin lemishpachosechem. You should draw out and take a sheep from among your flock, and for each family. This was the beginning of the idea of offering the Paschal lamb. But what's interesting about the verse is it could have simply said every family should take one of these sheep. Why does the Torah, which is very precise about its usage of words, say you should mishchu, you should draw out? So the answer, our sages explain, is that we should draw ourselves out and away from whatever that lamb represented. Not simply take it and bring it as an offering. Draw out and draw away from it. Because the lamb was actually one of the animals that the Egyptians worshipped and considered holy. The parallel to understand that would be if you go to India today, you'll see that cows are treated sometimes, unfortunately, with more respect than some human beings because they're deified, the cow. So imagine the Egyptians deified animals and they deified the sheep. And now you're telling the Jewish people, go take an animal that your masters, your slave masters consider a god, and take it into your home. The first step in deprogramming the Jews was to force them or to command them to take something that was considered idolatry, to confront idolatry, to look at it in the eye and see what it really is. And they took it a number of days before they actually slaughtered it. For 4 days, the Jewish people kept that animal in their house. They watched it. They watched how it needed to be fed. They watched how it needed to urinate and go to the bathroom. They watched how it couldn't escape on its own because they tied it to a post with a rope to keep it in place. They saw its limited power, that this was something that the Egyptians worshipped as a god. They had to confront that and see it for what it really was. Then the Jewish people were commanded to take that animal and slaughter it. Can you imagine the trauma of trying to convince people who knew that the powerful nation of Egypt worshiped this animal as a god, and now they're being told that they have to slaughter it? That forced them to take an additional step of recognizing that this animal was not a deity. Once they slaughtered it, they had to cook it in a certain way. Now, many people are not aware of this. They had to barbecue it, so to speak, roast it on a spit where the animal was completely whole. We see this sometimes at major barbecues where they put the animal on that. Why? Why not say that they could cut it up and make a stew, lamb stew? Why not do it that way? Because they wanted the Jewish people, God wanted the Jewish people to see this animal as it's being consumed by the fire, that it had no power to rescue it. It also forced the Jewish people, the Israelites, to do it in front of the Egyptians because all the Egyptians could see that this animal was being roasted and killed, their deity. But additional reason why it's roasted is because anyone that's been to a barbecue knows that the aroma of the barbecue can travel for hundreds and hundreds of feet. Unlike if you make something in a soup. That was done in order that the Jews could not deny the fact that the Egyptians would see what they're doing, to something that they deified. Every one of these steps of how they prepared the Paschal animal, the lamb, was a step in forcing the Jews to confront that the deities of the Egyptians did not have supernatural powers. They could not save themselves. That's why we read a verse in the book of Proverbs that says, Atzabeim kesef v'zohav, ma'aseh yedei adam, their gods are gold and silver, they're the work of hands. Peh lahem v'lo yedaberu, they have a mouth but they don't speak. Af lahem v'lo yirichu, they have a nose and they don't smell. Einayim lahem v'lo yiru, they have eyes and they don't see. In the book of Psalms, it's telling us that people cannot worship things that have these limited powers of what they can do and what they can't do. We worship God who transcends all these limitations. Whenever the Torah describes God as speaking or talking, it's all an anthropomorphic concept so that we human beings can understand something about God. Not that God actually speaks like a human, not that God has a mouth. That would limit God. God is so transcendent of all limitations that all of those terms don't truly apply to them. We use them so that we can understand something about how God chooses to interact with us. So we see here that the purpose of coming out of Egypt isn't simply or not alone to celebrate that we're no longer slaves. Because if that was the point, we have been enslaved and embittered for generations. It wasn't just the Egyptians. We say, B'chol dover dor, every generation, Amad aleinu, they stand against us. Every generation there's been people. You can list them. If it was the Babylonians after the Egyptians, it was the Greeks, it was the Persian Empire, the Greeks, the Turkish Empire, the Nazis, Yamach Shemo. These are people that all tried to destroy us. So it didn't just disappear. And now we have in our generation our own challenges of people that want to destroy us. So to achieve freedom is to recognize God's ability to save us from these challenges, but also to recognize that God gives us the tools, the spiritual tools to make ourselves better so that we stand as a light to the nations, so that we will always share the ethics and the morality and the holiness that Judaism offers, not only to the Jewish people, but to the entire world, that all people will see that there is one God who wants us to be good and honest and moral people and live in a way where we transform the world into a holy place. As we read a few weeks ago, it says in the Torah, Asuli migdash v'shchanti b'sochem, build me a sanctuary and I will dwell in it. So God wanted a place where the focus of Jewish prayer could be centered to help Jews be able to reach that deeper essence of who they are. But in the Hebrew, the word v'shchanti b'socham, as we have been taught, is plural. Build me a sanctuary and I'll dwell in them. So the Hasidic masters explain that to mean, don't just build a sanctuary, a physical sanctuary of wood and material items, but make yourself into a sanctuary. Make yourself into a place where God can dwell and illuminate the world. And in the same way that the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, as that King Solomon built, had windows that were wide on the outside and narrow on the inside, which allowed the light of the temple to spread out to the world. We are meant to be that light to the nations and spread the knowledge of God, the knowledge of Torah, the values and the morality, which have really stood by us through all these generations. A person recently told me that in Europe, they uncovered a home that had not been decimated by the Nazis. And they found in the home a painting, a Jewish painting. And the Jewish painting represented the Jewish people going out into being drawn into exile, being chased from town to town, like we know they were done throughout history. And the archaeologist that discovered this house, who was not Jewish, he said he was surprised at what was in the painting. The Jews were holding some of their most precious items, their possessions, to take with them as they were fleeing from persecution. And the archaeologist apologized. He said, I thought that they would be holding their silver, their money. He was bought into that old trope of the Jews being money hungry. But what he noticed is that they were all carrying Torah scrolls, Sifrei Torah. That was what was important for them to save from the synagogue that was being burnt. That was what was important for them to go to another town or another country and establish themselves again. Because they knew that it's not money. Money comes and goes. But the values and the teachings that are in our Torah, that is what has enabled the Jewish people to strive. And we see more and more people throughout Israel and throughout the diaspora are discovering that, especially after the horrible massacre of October 7th, that we should never have a meeting where we don't mention it and recall the people that passed away, and their names should be for a blessing, and that their souls should be. I'm breaking up in tears just thinking about it, but God should be merciful on them, and we should remember that even in these times, as a result of these horrible things, many people are re-exploring and rediscovering their faith and their identity. And this recalls the words of Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, where he says that in the days before the coming of the messianic age of Mashiach, it says that the Jewish people will have an experience where the children will teach the parents, and the parents will teach their children, and they will return back to serving God. And we find this also another concept about Eliyahu Navi in this week's Torah, Haftorah, connected to the Torah portion of this week, which is called Shabbos HaGodol. The Shabbos before Passover is called the Great Shabbos. You might have thought that the Shabbos before Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah would be the Great Shabbat, but it's the Shabbos before Passover, which is called Shabbos HaGodol, because it's on this Shabbos that we recall the fact that the Jews rejected idolatry. That's what made it great. And this is why the last verse in the Haftorah says, Hine anochi sholeach lachem es Eliyahu hanavi lifnei bo yom Adonai hagodol v'hanora. Behold, I will send you Eliyahu the prophet before the great and awesome day of God comes. And Eliyahu is meant to turn the hearts of the children to the parents and the parents to the children. There will be a reawakening that all of us who are like children to God will have our own spiritual awakening in our relationship to our identity. And it should be our prayer that this should happen, and that the way to combat the influences of outside groups, whether they are the temptation toward cults or idolatrous practices in different religions, or being so caught up in materiality that we don't have our moral compass on straight, that we have that ability to explore Judaism and find a way of peace and harmony to be able to serve Hashem with blessings and holiness. So I want to wish everyone a beautiful and special Pesach. It should be filled with blessings. It should be filled with that humility that we spoke about, so that we can grow and continue to grow in our holiness. And I'm going to allow people to type any questions that they want, and I'll try now to answer some questions. And I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to wish you a very kosher and freilich. Freilich in Yiddish means happy. Pesach Sameach, should have a happy Pesach. Enjoy your family. Try to look at Pesach in a spiritual way and beyond the simple reading of the Haggadah, and look more deeply into it and get something that affects your life. Okay, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you all at the next podcast. I do want to mention that for those of you that are still on, I hope you can see this. My new book, Know What to Answer When Someone Challenges Your Faith, is now available in the United States and Canada. You can get it on Amazon. If you're here in Israel, you can contact me through info@JewsForJudaism.org, because I printed copies here, and it's a great resource for you. It goes through the entire Torah, each portion of the Torah, and has spiritual lessons and answers to different challenges that people pose to us. So thank you very much. I want to wish you all, once again, a beautiful Shabbat and a beautiful Pesach. Good night.